The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the Jefferson County Courthouse, slicing the polished wooden floor with golden beams. Dust motes floated lazily in the air, drifting like tiny specters in the silence that had settled over the courtroom. It was the kind of silence that pressed on the chest, heavy and expectant, where even the faintest shuffle of papers felt like a gunshot. Inside, rows of chairs were filled with spectators, most of them ordinary citizens curious about a trial that had already made local headlines. Some whispered to each other in low, nervous tones, while others simply sat, wide-eyed, unsure of what to expect. At the back, a pair of uniformed officers remained standing, their eyes scanning the room, alert and unblinking. Among them sat Officer Daniels, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 30s, his posture rigid with a mix of duty and unease. By his side, his K-9 partner, Rex, a muscular German shepherd with a sleek black and tan coat, sat perfectly still, ears twitching ever so slightly, tail resting quietly on the floor. There was a quiet intensity in the dog's gaze, the kind only those who had served together on countless missions could recognize. The judge, a stern woman with silver-streaked hair and wire-rimmed glasses perched on the tip of her nose, tapped her gavel lightly against the desk. She looked down at the pile of case files in front of her, flipping through them with a practiced hand, but her brow furrowed as she glanced up at the courtroom. "We are gathered here today to address the case of State versus Martin Keller," she began, her voice calm but authoritative. "The charges are serious, and I ask that everyone maintain order while proceedings continue." In the center of the room, seated in the witness area, was a small cluster of people who seemed almost out of place. A young mother clutching the hand of a tiny child, barely 3 years old. The girl, Emma, had golden curls that framed her cherubic face, wide blue eyes that reflected both innocence and curiosity, and a small, pink dress that made her look even smaller than she was. She fidgeted slightly in her chair, her tiny fingers entwined tightly with her mother. Her mother, Elizabeth, a woman in her late 20s with a calm yet worried demeanor, glanced at her daughter nervously. She had hoped the child wouldn't be here, hadn't imagined that a 3-year-old would be called upon in a courtroom full of tension and authority. Yet fate had other plans. Emma's eyes roamed the room, taking in the towering figures in black robes, the uniformed officers, the reporters with cameras and notepads, and then finally she landed on Rex. There was something about the dog that drew her attention immediately, a kind of silent strength, an almost human awareness in his eyes. She leaned slightly toward her mother and whispered something, but her mother shushed her gently, glancing nervously at the judge. Officer Daniels caught the movement out of the corner of his eye. He had worked with Rex for years, and the bond between man and dog was something unspoken yet profound. Rex, sensing the subtle shift in energy in the room, sat up straighter, ears pricked. The dog had been trained for countless situations, but there was a rare tension in the air today that even he seemed to acknowledge. The courtroom clerk began calling names, papers shuffled, and the murmurs quieted as the attorneys prepared their notes. The defendant, Martin Keller, a man in his early 40s with a hardened expression and a restless energy, sat at the defense table, hands folded but eyes darting nervously toward the witness area. He had been accused of a series of crimes that had shaken the local community, and today's testimony, unexpectedly including a tiny child, could change the trajectory of the trial. The judge raised a hand for silence and the room fell completely still. "We will begin with preliminary statements from the prosecution," she said, her voice echoing slightly in the high-ceilinged room. The prosecuting attorney, a sharp-eyed woman in her 30s, stood and began outlining the case with practiced authority. She spoke of evidence, witness testimonies, and the seriousness of the charges, but every word seemed to fade into background noise for one observer in particular, Emma. Emma's attention never left Rex. She leaned slightly forward in her chair, tiny hands gripping her mother's tightly, and pointed toward the dog. It was a subtle movement, almost imperceptible, but it carried a weight that seemed disproportionate to her size. Elizabeth noticed immediately. "Emma, sweetheart, don't," she began, but her voice was drowned out by the murmurs of the courtroom. Rex, trained to respond only to specific cues, remained still but alert. Officer Daniels noticed the tiny girl pointing and felt a jolt of curiosity. He had never seen her this focused on the dog before. There was something almost human in the way she was communicating, an instinctive connection that defied explanation. The spectators began to notice the small hand trembling slightly as Emma pointed. A hush fell over the room, heavier than before. Even the judge paused, adjusting her glasses as she leaned forward, her eyes narrowing slightly. Something unusual was happening, something that demanded attention. Emma's lips moved softly, forming words that only her mother could hear. "He did," she whispered. Elizabeth froze, a chill running down her spine. She hadn't expected this, hadn't anticipated that her child could articulate anything related to the case. But the words were clear, deliberate, and filled with an unexpected gravity. Officer Daniels exchanged a glance with the prosecuting attorney, who had paused mid-sentence. The dog, sensing the subtle shift in energy, gave a soft, low whine, a sound almost imperceptible but charged with anticipation. It was as if even Rex knew that a moment of significance had arrived. The judge's eyes scanned the courtroom. She could feel the collective attention turning toward the small girl, the tiny hand pointing with unwavering certainty at the K-9 sitting a few feet away. "Order," she said firmly, but her voice was tinged with curiosity. She leaned closer, whispering more to herself than anyone else. "What is this child about to say?" Emma's mother swallowed hard, her hand tightening around her daughter's. She could feel the tension radiating through every corner of the room, a tension so palpable it seemed to make the wooden benches hum. She whispered softly, "Emma, honey, it's okay," but her voice trembled. She didn't know what her daughter was sensing, didn't know what she was about to say. The courtroom held its collective breath, the kind of silence that stretches seconds into eternities. Every adult present leaned forward, some unconsciously, some intentionally, sensing that the normal rhythm of a trial was about to be broken by something extraordinary. Emma's finger remained pointed at Rex. Her eyes, wide and unflinching, seemed to pierce the very fabric of the room, as if she could see something invisible to everyone else. The small child's gaze carried the weight of an unspoken truth, a clarity that even the seasoned officers and attorneys could not ignore. And then, almost imperceptibly, she whispered again. This time, her voice carried across the thin veil of noise and expectation. "He did." The words hung in the air, delicate yet thunderous, as if the entire room had collectively exhaled in shock. Conversations froze mid-sentence, pens hovered over notebooks, and even the air seemed to still in anticipation. A 3-year-old had just pointed and spoken, delivering 2 words that no one in that courtroom would ever forget. The judge leaned back in her chair, adjusting her glasses again, her face a mask of professionalism, yet her eyes betrayed disbelief. Officer Daniels' heart raced. He looked at Rex, who now sat with a rigid focus, tail still, eyes locked on the child. The prosecuting attorney scribbled notes frantically, sensing that this small moment could be pivotal. The defense attorney's knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the table. Every adult in the courtroom knew one thing. Something extraordinary was unfolding. The room was no longer just a space for legal procedure. It had become the stage for an unlikely alliance between a tiny child and a police dog, an alliance that would challenge perceptions, demand attention, and perhaps even change the course of justice itself. Emma's mother whispered softly into her daughter's ear, trying to calm her, but the child's gaze remained fixed, unwavering. She knew something, felt something, and her innocent words had just cracked open a door that no one had expected to open today. And in that heavy silence, the room waited. Everyone, judge, attorneys, officers, spectators, waited for what the little girl would say next, and for the truth that only she seemed capable of revealing. The courtroom had gone utterly silent, the kind of silence that presses down on your chest and makes even your heartbeat feel loud. All eyes were locked on the tiny figure of Emma, perched in her chair with a straight back and wide, blue eyes. She pointed at Rex, the police dog, her finger trembling ever so slightly, and whispered two words that rippled through the room like a thunderclap. He did. The murmurs that had filled the courtroom moments ago had vanished. Lawyers, officers, and spectators froze mid-motion. Some people's jaws dropped, others clutched their notepads as if bracing themselves against a sudden storm. Officer Daniels' hands tightened around Rex's leash, though the dog remained perfectly still, ears pricked and gaze sharp. It was as if Rex sensed the weight of those two small words. Elizabeth, Emma's mother, felt her stomach drop. "Emma, honey, no, don't say anything more," she whispered, panic threading her voice. But it was too late. The courtroom had already tuned into the child, and there was no turning back. The judge, a woman who had presided over hundreds of cases, leaned forward in her chair, her eyes narrowing in cautious curiosity. "Emma," she began softly, her voice steady but tinged with incredulity, "can you tell us who?" Emma's lips pressed together. She looked past her mother, past the spectators, and directly at the defendant, Martin Keller, sitting tensely at the defense table. Her eyes, unblinking, held a strange kind of certainty that silenced even the murmurs of disbelief. Slowly, she pointed her tiny finger at him again. Him," she said, her voice clear and deliberate. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. Even the hardened officers and attorneys exchanged stunned glances. There was an unspoken question hanging in the air. How could a toddler, barely 3 years old, recognize something so serious, so dangerous, something that adults had spent weeks investigating? Officer Daniels felt his heart pound. Rex, trained to respond only to cues, twitched slightly, his nose wrinkling as if he recognized the tension in the room. The dog's behavior was precise, trained yet instinctive, and it only heightened the courtroom's growing unease. The prosecuting attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Claire Reynolds, scribbled notes furiously. Her pen barely touched the paper, her mind racing. If this child's identification is accurate, this could change everything. The defense attorney, a tall man with thinning hair, paled. He leaned back in his chair, muttering under his breath, "This is preposterous, a child, a dog. How can the court even entertain this?" But the judge remained calm, her expression carefully neutral. She was a woman who had seen many cases, many witnesses, and many surprising moments, but this was entirely unprecedented. She tapped the gavel lightly. "All right," she said, voice steady. "Let's proceed carefully. Officer Daniels, please bring Rex closer to the witness stand." The courtroom held its breath as the officer stood and led Rex forward. The dog's paws clicked softly against the wooden floor, each step deliberate. Spectators leaned forward, their curiosity palpable. Even Emma's mother, though anxious, couldn't help but feel a glimmer of pride at the bravery her tiny daughter displayed. Emma's small hand remained extended toward the dog. She didn't flinch as Rex approached, and for a brief moment, the two seemed to communicate in silence. The courtroom was struck by the uncanny connection between the toddler and the trained K9. Then Emma's other hand pointed directly at Martin Keller again. "He's the one," she said with a certainty that defied her age. Whispers erupted across the room. Some leaned toward their neighbors in disbelief, others were frozen, unable to speak. The judge's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing, letting the tension build. She had seen witnesses with false confidence, people who lied with practiced ease, but something about Emma's gaze was different. It carried truth, and it carried instinct. Officer Daniels knelt beside Rex, encouraging the dog to focus. "Rex, you know what to do," he murmured softly. The German shepherd tilted his head slightly, sniffing the air, his gaze alternating between Emma and the defendant. Rex's tail, which had been still, twitched once, twice, then stopped. The courtroom seemed to lean in collectively, as if every person could feel the energy between the child and the dog. Emma's mother felt her breath hitch. She whispered, "Sweetheart, it's okay," But Emma didn't move. She didn't need comfort. She knew what she saw, what she felt, and the conviction in her small voice was unwavering. The defense attorney rose abruptly. "Your Honor, this is absurd. A child cannot be considered credible evidence, and a dog, this is preposterous." His voice trembled with frustration, and the veins in his neck stood out. But his protest barely registered. Every person in the room could see the undeniable truth in the child's eyes, in the dog's reactions. Claire Reynolds, the prosecutor, spoke next, her voice firm but tinged with awe. "Your Honor, this child has identified the defendant. Rex, our trained K9, corroborates the identification through scent recognition and behavior cues. This is not fantasy. It is factual based on trained observation and instinct." The judge adjusted her glasses and studied the scene carefully. "This court recognizes the unusual circumstances," she said slowly, "and will allow this evidence for consideration, pending proper verification. Proceed with caution." Emma's eyes never left the defendant. She took a small breath and whispered again, this time louder so that even those in the back could hear. "He hurt the puppy." A collective gasp echoed. The tiny words carried weight far beyond her age. The courtroom seemed to shiver. What had the defendant done? How could this child know something so specific? The atmosphere thickened with tension, every adult in the room suddenly aware that they were witnessing something extraordinary, justice unfolding through innocence. Officer Daniels placed a steady hand on Rex's collar, feeling the dog's tension mirror his own. He glanced at Emma and saw the unwavering courage in her eyes. She wasn't just pointing. She wasn't just speaking. She was revealing a truth no one else could articulate, a clarity only a child and a dog together could provide. The judge's gavel hovered above the desk, the moment stretching as if time itself had paused. Cameras clicked, pens scribbled furiously, and every spectator leaned forward, knowing they were part of a rare and unforgettable event. Emma's mother gripped her daughter tightly, whispering a prayer under her breath. She had always known Emma was perceptive beyond her years, but today she realized just how profound that perception could be. The defendant, Martin Keller, shifted in his chair. His eyes darted from Emma to Rex and back again, a flicker of fear passing over his features. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to set off alarm bells in the courtroom. Even the defense attorney noticed, though he quickly tried to mask it. For a moment, it seemed as though the entire courtroom was suspended in a bubble of tension. The air was thick, almost tangible, charged with anticipation. Every person present felt the weight of what was happening. A tiny child speaking words far beyond her age, pointing at a police dog, identifying a defendant in a way no adult had done. Then, almost imperceptibly, Emma's lips moved again. "He did it," she said, louder this time, every syllable carrying the weight of undeniable truth. The room went silent once more. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Every person, judge, jury, attorneys, spectators, officers, understood that something remarkable had just occurred. The words of a 3-year-old had pierced through the layers of doubt, skepticism, and adult complexity. And now the courtroom waited, tense and silent, for the next revelation. The courtroom seemed to shrink in that instant, the walls pressing inward as every eye remained fixed on the tiny figure of Emma. She sat perched on her chair, her little legs swinging slightly, her chubby fingers gripping her mother's hand as though for both comfort and support. But the tremble in her grip didn't diminish the force behind her gaze, clear, unwavering, and impossibly precise. Martin Keller, the defendant, stiffened. His usually confident posture cracked as his eyes darted nervously between the child and Rex. The seasoned criminal, accustomed to intimidation and manipulation, now faced something he could not control. A 3-year-old and a police dog had become instruments of truth in a way no one had anticipated. The judge, sitting high on the bench, adjusted her glasses, her expression carefully neutral. But even her composed exterior could not mask the flicker of astonishment in her eyes. She had presided over countless trials, seen witnesses lie with polished eloquence, and heard stories that twisted the truth beyond recognition. Yet here, in front of her, a toddler's words carried a clarity that no adult had offered, a clarity that could not be fabricated. "Emma," the judge said gently, leaning forward. Her voice was calm but carried the weight of authority. "Can you tell us exactly what happened?" Emma's eyes never left the defendant. Her small mouth moved carefully, forming words that belied her age. "He hurt the puppy," she whispered again, louder this time, enunciating each word as if they carried a sacred weight. A ripple of disbelief swept through the courtroom. Spectators gasped. Murmurs spread like wildfire among journalists scribbling furiously in notebooks. Even seasoned officers exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of awe and disbelief. Officer Daniels knelt beside Rex, keeping a firm hand on the dog's collar. Rex's ears were pricked, his body taut with attention. The dog sniffed the air carefully, his gaze flicking from the child to the defendant and back again. Every trained instinct of the K-9 seemed to confirm what Emma had just said. Claire Reynolds, the prosecuting attorney, rose from her chair. Her voice, calm yet tinged with excitement, cut through the murmurs. "Your Honor, we are witnessing a unique form of corroboration. The child has identified the perpetrator, and Rex, trained in scent and behavior detection, has responded to the defendant as expected. This is not conjecture, this is fact." The defense attorney shot to his feet, veins bulging on his forehead. "Objection! This is absurd. A toddler cannot be considered a credible witness. And the dog, this is nonsense. We are not in a fantasy." But even as he spoke, his words seemed hollow, drowned out by the intensity of the moment. Emma's gaze, so unwavering and pure, held a kind of undeniable truth. It was a truth that no adult argument could outweigh. Elizabeth, Emma's mother, felt a cold sweat run down her back. Her heart pounded. She had always known her daughter was observant, sensitive, and intuitive, but she had never imagined this, never that her tiny child would be thrust into the epicenter of justice in such a monumental way. Emma leaned slightly forward, her tiny finger pointing directly at Martin Keller again. "He did it," she said, her voice firmer now. Each word struck like a hammer, precise and unwavering. The courtroom collectively froze. Even the judge took a breath, her gavel suspended in the air. For a moment, no one moved. Every adult present felt the weight of the child's words. They were simple, yet heavy, innocent, yet devastatingly accurate. Rex shifted slightly, a subtle motion but enough to be noticed. His nose twitched. He sniffed the defendant once, twice, then gave a small, low growl, controlled but unmistakable. The dog's behavior added another layer of credibility to Emma's testimony, a layer that could not be ignored. The spectators leaned forward, captivated. Reporters scribbled faster, their hands shaking slightly. Cameras flashed sporadically, capturing the tiny heroine and her canine partner, who together had managed to unearth a truth that had been carefully concealed. The defense attorney's protest grew louder. "This is a circus. A child. A dog. It's preposterous to even suggest this could influence a legal outcome." He slammed his fist lightly against the table, but the sound seemed muffled, weak against the weight of what was unfolding. Officer Daniels gave Rex a reassuring pat on the neck, murmuring softly, "It's okay, boy. Just stay focused." The dog's eyes remained locked on Emma, as if understanding that her words were not mere childlike babble. They were guiding him, guiding justice itself. The judge finally broke the silence. "We will allow this testimony for consideration," she said, her voice firm. "We recognize the unusual circumstances, but the safety and integrity of this courtroom demand that we proceed carefully." Emma's small chest rose and fell rapidly, a mix of excitement, fear, and determination. She had done what no one expected. She had spoken truth, a truth so clear it demanded attention. Her mother hugged her slightly, whispering, "You're so brave, baby, so brave." The courtroom seemed to settle into a tense anticipation, every person sensing that the next moments could be pivotal. The child had spoken, the dog had responded. All that remained was the unfolding of consequences. And then Emma, her tiny voice trembling but steady, said something that made the air grow even heavier. "He took the puppy's paw." A collective gasp swept through the room, louder than any before. The words were simple, but the implication was horrifying. What had Martin Keller done? How could a toddler know such specific details? And why had Rex reacted the way he did? The prosecuting attorney immediately rose, sensing the significance of Emma's revelation. "Your Honor, this is precisely why we must take this testimony seriously. The child's observation, combined with Rex's behavior, gives us insight into events that would otherwise remain hidden." Even the judge nodded slightly, her expression serious. She had presided over many cases of abuse, many instances of hidden crime, but she had never witnessed anything like this. A child, barely able to speak in full sentences, identifying not just a suspect, but the nature of the crime itself. Martin Keller shifted uncomfortably, sweat forming on his brow. The room seemed to close in on him. For the first time in weeks, he seemed vulnerable, exposed. His usual defenses, sharp words and a hardened stare, were useless against the piercing clarity of a child's perception and a dog's trained instincts. Rex let out a soft bark, almost a question, and then sniffed toward the defendant again. His behavior was subtle but deliberate, a trained confirmation of Emma's claims. Officer Daniels' eyes widened slightly. He had never seen the dog respond like this in a courtroom setting, yet he knew instinctively that Rex was confirming the child's identification. The spectators watched in awe, some covering their mouths in disbelief. Reporters exchanged rapid whispers, realizing that they were witnessing a story that would likely make national headlines. Cameras clicked, capturing images that would soon circulate across the country. A toddler pointing her finger, a police dog reacting with trained intuition, and a courtroom holding its collective breath. Elizabeth held her daughter tightly, feeling the tiny heartbeat against her chest. "You're amazing, Emma," she whispered, tears threatening to spill. But Emma's attention was still entirely on the defendant. She didn't flinch, didn't falter. She had spoken truth, and she had done it with a courage that belied her age. The judge finally spoke, her voice cutting through the tension. "We will proceed with verification and further questioning. This court recognizes the extraordinary nature of this testimony, but we must ensure accuracy and reliability." Even as she spoke, everyone in the room knew the trial had shifted. The balance of power had changed. A 3-year-old child with nothing but her innocence and clarity, and a police dog with instinct and training, had pierced the defenses of a hardened criminal. The moment hung heavy in the air. Everyone knew the next steps would be critical. Emma had spoken, Rex had confirmed, and Martin Keller, the defendant, had no choice but to face a truth he could not deny. The courtroom had reached a delicate stillness, the kind of tension that made even the hum of the overhead lights feel deafening. Every person present felt it, the kind of moment that would be etched into memory for years to come. Emma's words, so small yet monumental, hung in the air like an invisible weight. Judge Hartwell, a woman known for her meticulous adherence to procedure and her stern demeanor, leaned back slightly in her chair, her eyes scanning the courtroom as though trying to measure the extraordinary against the mundane. She had been a judge for over 2 decades, presiding over high-profile cases, violent crimes, and intricate legal disputes. She had seen witnesses lie with practiced ease, lawyers twist words with surgical precision, and yet never had she encountered a situation like this. A toddler, a police dog, and an accusation that had stunned the entire court. She adjusted her glasses, tapped her gavel lightly, and spoke in a measured tone. "Officer Daniels, please bring your K-9 partner, Rex, closer to the witness stand." The officer nodded, his hand tightening around Rex's collar. The German shepherd rose gracefully, his movements smooth, practiced, and precise, the epitome of a law enforcement partner in control yet alert. Paws clicked against the polished floor as they moved forward, the sound echoing faintly through the high-ceilinged room. Spectators leaned forward in anticipation. The media photographers held their cameras at the ready, knowing this was a moment that could make headlines nationwide. Even the lawyers on both sides seemed to hold their breath. Elizabeth held Emma tightly, whispering, "Sweetheart, you're doing so well." Her voice trembled despite her effort to remain calm. Emma's blue eyes, wide and unwavering, followed Rex as he approached, her small hand still outstretched toward the dog. The judge's gaze softened, but her voice remained firm. "Emma, you have already identified the defendant and shared what you observed. Is there anything else you can tell the court?" Emma's gaze shifted slightly, moving from Rex to Martin Keller and back to Rex. Her tiny lips parted. "He's the one," she said again, her voice stronger, imbued with the certainty of conviction. Gasps rippled across the courtroom. Even the most seasoned officers exchanged looks of disbelief. It was one thing for a child to speak words. It was another for those words to carry the weight of truth, corroborated by a trained police dog. Officer Daniels knelt beside Rex, murmuring softly, "Do your part, boy. Stay focused." Rex responded with a subtle shift in posture, his eyes never leaving Emma, as if acknowledging her silent command. The defense attorney's face drained of color. He rose abruptly, voice trembling with fury. "Your Honor, this is an outrage. A child cannot be considered a credible witness. A dog cannot testify. I object to this entire proceeding." But the judge did not flinch. She had anticipated resistance, but she also understood the stakes. She looked directly at the defense attorney. "Objection noted. However, this court recognizes the extraordinary circumstances and will allow this testimony for consideration, pending verification. This is unprecedented, yes, but we cannot ignore a child's direct observation corroborated by trained law enforcement." A murmur of astonishment swept through the courtroom. People leaned forward, eyes wide. Even reporters, usually impervious to courtroom theatrics, were captivated. Emma's mother, Elizabeth, felt a shiver run down her spine. She had known Emma was perceptive, but the strength, bravery, and clarity her daughter displayed in this moment left her both proud and fearful. "My baby," she whispered, hugging her tightly, "you're so brave." Emma did not respond with words. Her attention remained fixed, unwavering. She was not seeking comfort. She was conveying truth, and her innocence lent it an unassailable weight. Rex, sensing the heightened tension, moved closer to Emma, nose twitching as he sniffed the air, then focused intently on the defendant. The courtroom collectively held its breath. Every subtle movement of the dog, trained yet instinctive, was magnified in importance by the gravity of the situation. The prosecuting attorney, Claire Reynolds, rose again, her voice controlled but edged with excitement. "Your Honor, the child has identified the perpetrator, and Rex has reacted in accordance with his training. This is not fantasy or conjecture. This is trained observation and corroborated instinct. We request that this testimony be fully considered." The judge tapped her gavel lightly. "Proceed with caution," she said. "However, the court acknowledges that this testimony is extraordinary and may provide critical insight into the case." The spectators murmured in disbelief. Cameras clicked. Every reporter scribbled feverishly. A sense of history hung in the air. Everyone present understood that they were witnessing something beyond ordinary courtroom procedure. Martin Keller shifted in his chair, a bead of sweat tracing down his temple. He had faced threats, witnesses, and investigators before, but never like this. A 3-year-old child and a police dog had become the instruments of his exposure, piercing through his layers of deception with a clarity that no adult could contest. Emma, small but resolute, pointed her tiny finger once more at the defendant. "He hurt the puppy," she said, the words deliberate, each syllable striking the courtroom like a hammer. A ripple of gasps moved through the room. Spectators whispered among themselves, some shielding their mouths in shock. Even the judge's normally unflappable demeanor betrayed a flicker of disbelief. Officer Daniels nodded to the prosecuting attorney, confirming what he already knew in his gut. Rex's reaction, combined with Emma's testimony, was irrefutable. The dog's trained instincts and the child's innocent clarity had intersected perfectly, shining a light on a truth that had long been concealed. The defense attorney, realizing the precariousness of the situation, tried to rally. "Your Honor, I insist that this be dismissed. A child's words cannot constitute evidence. A dog's behavior is circumstantial at best." But the judge remained firm. "This court will allow the testimony for consideration. Extraordinary circumstances require extraordinary attention. The court recognizes the child's observations and the dog's trained responses as part of the evidentiary record. Let us proceed with caution and thoroughness." The courtroom seemed to exhale collectively. The tension, thick and suffocating, did not dissipate entirely, but the judge's decisive ruling had given structure to the chaos. Justice was now in motion, propelled by a force that no adult could have anticipated. Innocence and instinct intertwined. Elizabeth hugged Emma again, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. She whispered, "You're amazing, my little hero." Emma's gaze, steady and unyielding, met hers briefly, then returned to the defendant. She was not looking for praise. She was looking for truth. Rex sat alert, every muscle taut with attention. The dog's presence, steady and commanding, reinforced the courtroom's focus on the events that had unfolded and the words that had been spoken. As the judge leaned forward, tapping her gavel to regain complete silence, she spoke with a tone that carried authority and empathy. "We are witnessing an unusual moment in this courtroom. A child's clarity and a K-9's trained observation may provide critical insight into this case. Let us proceed methodically, but let us also acknowledge the significance of this moment." A hush fell again, heavier than before. The courtroom seemed suspended, caught in a delicate balance between the ordinary and the extraordinary. Every movement, every glance, every word from that point onward would carry weight beyond the typical gravity of legal proceedings. And then Emma, small and resolute, whispered once more, her voice carrying across the courtroom, "He's lying." The word, simple yet loaded, rippled through the room. It was more than an accusation, it was a revelation. Everyone froze, hearts pounding. The judge paused, gavel raised, acknowledging the moment. Even Martin Keller's face lost all traces of composure. The courtroom hung in a taut silence, the kind that made every movement seem amplified. Emma, barely 3 years old, sat upright in her chair, her small hand gripping her mother's tightly. Her blue eyes were wide, unblinking, fixed entirely on Martin Keller. The child's 2 words had already sent ripples through the room, and now, with Rex, the K-9 trained for high-stakes investigations, standing beside Officer Daniels, the atmosphere was electric. Officer Daniels knelt beside Rex, murmuring softly, "Stay calm, boy. Focus." The dog's ears twitched, his powerful nose sniffing the air, every muscle taut with attention. Trained to detect scents of fear, deception, and evidence of past crimes, Rex's body language was subtle yet unmistakable. The judge, perched on her bench with gavel in hand, observed the delicate interplay between child and dog with a mixture of fascination and authority. She had already ruled to allow Emma's testimony, acknowledging the extraordinary circumstances, but even she could not predict the dramatic confirmation that was about to unfold. Claire Reynolds, the prosecuting attorney, rose carefully from her chair. "Your Honor," she began, voice calm yet charged with anticipation, "we are about to witness corroboration that is unprecedented in this courtroom. The child has identified the defendant, and Rex, trained in scent detection, will confirm this identification." The defense attorney, trying to maintain composure, slammed a hand lightly on the table. "This is ridiculous. A child and a dog cannot be considered credible. I demand this line of questioning be dismissed." The judge raised a hand, her voice firm. "Objection noted. Proceed with caution." Rex took a deliberate step forward, nose low to the ground, sniffing at the air between Emma and the defendant. Every eye in the courtroom tracked the dog's movements, the tension so thick it felt as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Emma leaned slightly forward in her chair, pointing again at the defendant. "He did it," she said softly but clearly, the weight of her words heavier than any adult's testimony could ever be. Officer Daniels felt a surge of pride mixed with apprehension. He had trained Rex for years, in every conceivable situation, from missing persons to narcotics detection, but nothing had prepared him for the courtroom, where a child's innocence intersected with a dog's trained instinct to reveal truth. Rex sniffed the defendant's clothing, then back to Emma, then again to Keller, his movements precise, deliberate, and full of trained instinct. He emitted a soft, low growl, controlled but unmistakable, a behavioral cue that officers had been trained to recognize as confirmation of suspicion. The courtroom gasped. Some spectators leaned forward, instinctively shielding their mouths in disbelief. Cameras flashed as reporters captured the incredible scene, a tiny child pointing, a K-9 confirming, and a defendant visibly shaken. Claire Reynolds stepped closer, her voice carrying clarity and authority. "Your Honor, the dog's behavior aligns with the child's testimony. Rex is trained to respond to cues of guilt and trauma. His response indicates recognition and corroboration of Emma's identification of the defendant." The defense attorney's hand shook slightly as he fumbled through his notes. "Objection. Circumstantial. A dog cannot testify in court." But the judge's gaze did not waver. This court recognizes the uniqueness of the situation. The dog's trained behavior is admissible as corroborative evidence, particularly in conjunction with the child's observations. Proceed. Elizabeth, Emma's mother, felt her heart hammering against her chest. She hugged her daughter instinctively, whispering, "You're so brave, baby." But Emma remained focused. Her tiny body radiated a confidence and clarity that defied her age. Emma's little finger pointed at Martin Keller with unwavering certainty. "He hurt the puppy," she repeated, her voice steady now, her words clear and deliberate. The room seemed to hold its collective breath. Even the stenographer paused briefly, pen hovering over paper. The weight of what was happening was almost unbearable. This was not just testimony. It was a moment of revelation, a convergence of innocence, instinct, and truth. Rex shifted slightly, a subtle movement, and then sat down firmly, tail still, eyes locked on the defendant. This trained position was one of alert recognition, a signal used by officers to confirm the presence of suspicious activity or evidence. Every adult in the courtroom understood the significance. Claire Reynolds's voice carried across the room. "The dog's response is consistent and deliberate. Officer Daniels, would you say this is an accurate reaction?" Officer Daniels nodded, his voice steady despite the tension. "Yes, ma'am. Rex is trained to respond to detection of guilt, fear, and evidence associated with a suspect. His behavior here aligns perfectly with the child's identification." The spectators gasped again, some whispering, some shaking their heads in disbelief. This was unprecedented, a toddler and a K-9 together identifying a defendant with clarity that even seasoned attorneys could not dispute. The defense attorney's voice cracked slightly as he shouted, "This is outrageous. You cannot convict a man on the basis of a child's words and a dog's behavior." Judge Hartwell leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. "This court is not relying solely on a child or a dog. We are not in corroboration that requires further investigation. However, the clarity of the child's observation and the K-9's trained response provide a critical avenue for establishing facts in this case." The courtroom remained tense, every person acutely aware of the magnitude of the moment. Emma's mother's heart raced as she held her daughter close, feeling both fear and pride. She whispered again, "You're amazing, Emma, so amazing." Emma's eyes never left the defendant. She took a small, measured breath. "He lied," she whispered. The word, simple but powerful, sent shivers through the room. Everyone leaned forward instinctively. It was more than an accusation. It was a revelation, an insight that only a child with her innocent perception could articulate. Martin Keller's face paled, his confident composure cracking visibly. For the first time, he seemed genuinely vulnerable, cornered in a way no adult witness had ever managed. The child's words, paired with the dog's trained behavior, left him exposed, his defenses crumbling under the weight of truth. The judge nodded slowly, acknowledging the profound impact of the moment. "We will proceed carefully," she said. "But the court recognizes the significance of this testimony and the corroborating evidence provided by trained law enforcement. This case has taken an extraordinary turn, and all parties must proceed accordingly." The spectators, previously murmuring among themselves, now watched in awe, captivated by the rare spectacle unfolding before them. Cameras clicked incessantly, capturing the powerful scene. A toddler pointing a finger, a police dog reacting with trained instinct, and a courtroom caught in collective suspense. Officer Daniels patted Rex on the head, murmuring softly, "Good boy, Rex. You did well." The dog's ears twitched, eyes remaining locked on the defendant, a silent confirmation of what Emma had already revealed. Elizabeth hugged Emma tightly, tears streaming down her cheeks. She whispered, "My little hero, my brave little hero." Emma simply nodded, still focused on the defendant. She was not seeking comfort. She was speaking truth, and she had the courage to see it through. Martin Keller shifted uncomfortably, sweat dripping down his temple. The courtroom had become a stage for something extraordinary, something that combined innocence, instinct, and truth. His usual tactics, lying, intimidation, and manipulation, were powerless here. The judge tapped her gavel lightly, restoring silence. "We will now proceed with further questioning and verification. This court acknowledges the unprecedented nature of today's testimony, but the facts presented thus far demand careful attention." The courtroom exhaled collectively, though tension still lingered like a thick fog. The extraordinary partnership between a child and a K-9 had unveiled a truth that adults alone could not discern. Justice, it seemed, was being guided by innocence and instinct. The courtroom was silent in a way that made every whispered breath feel loud. Emma, barely 3 years old, sat perched on her chair, gripping her mother's hand with a tiny fist. Her blue eyes, wide and unblinking, never left the defendant, Martin Keller. The weight of her words, her precise observations, and the K-9's trained responses had transformed a normal trial into something extraordinary, a spectacle of innocence and instinct revealing hidden truths. Judge Hartwell leaned forward, her hands clasped over her gavel, her sharp eyes scanning the room. She had presided over countless cases, but nothing like this. A child's testimony, corroborated by a police dog trained for life-and-death investigations, was beyond precedent. Her mind raced through procedure, evidence law, and courtroom decorum, but she also felt the undeniable gravity of what was unfolding. "Emma," the judge said gently, her voice carrying authority without intimidation, "you have spoken bravely and clearly. Can you tell the court anything more about what you saw?" Emma's lips pressed together. She took a deep, small breath, and her tiny finger extended once more, pointing directly at Martin Keller. He hit the puppy," she said, her voice steady. The words, simple and childlike, carried weight far beyond their brevity. The spectators shifted in their seats, murmuring in disbelief. Cameras clicked incessantly. Reporters scribbled furiously, realizing they were witnessing something that would captivate a nation. Officer Daniels knelt beside Rex. The German shepherd's posture was tense, ears pricked, eyes unwaveringly locked on the defendant. Every muscle in the dog's body radiated focus. He emitted a low, controlled growl, not a threat, but a trained signal of recognition and confirmation. The trained instinct of the dog reinforced the child's testimony in a way that words alone could not. Claire Reynolds, the prosecuting attorney, rose with calculated precision, her voice calm but charged with urgency. "Your Honor, the child's identification of the defendant, coupled with the K-9's response, provides clear corroboration that cannot be ignored. The defendant's guilt is evidenced not only by observation, but also by the trained instincts of law enforcement." The defense attorney's face was pale, his hands trembling as he adjusted his notes. "Objection! This is absurd. A child cannot be considered credible, and a dog, this is nonsense. We are here to rely on facts, not fantasies." Judge Hartwell's gaze did not waver. She had anticipated objections, resistance, and skepticism, but she was guided by the facts as they had manifested in the courtroom. "Objection noted," she said firmly. "However, this court acknowledges the extraordinary nature of the evidence and the corroboration provided. We will proceed with careful verification." Elizabeth, Emma's mother, held her daughter tightly, whispering reassurance while tears threatened to spill. "You're so brave, Emma, my brave little girl." Emma did not flinch or respond. Her focus remained solely on the defendant, the tiny figure of a child confronting a man who had caused harm she had witnessed. Martin Keller's composure was unraveling. Sweat formed along his hairline and his jaw tightened. He had faced tough witnesses, investigators and interrogators before, but never a 3-year-old child whose observations were clear and undeniable, nor a police dog whose trained instincts corroborated those observations. For the first time, his carefully constructed defenses were failing. Rex, sensing the defendant's fear, moved slightly forward, nose twitching, then sat with unwavering focus, a signal to Officer Daniels that the dog had recognized cues of guilt. Every subtle movement of the K-9 was magnified by the courtroom's tense silence. The judge tapped her gavel lightly, restoring order. "We will now proceed with verification and further questioning. This court recognizes that the child's observations and the K-9's responses may provide critical insight into the case." Emma's small voice, barely audible at first, grew stronger as she added another detail. "He threw the puppy in the box." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Gasps and whispered exclamations filled the air. Spectators leaned forward instinctively, some covering their mouths in disbelief. Reporters scribbled furiously, realizing they were recording a moment of courtroom history. Claire Reynolds, seizing the momentum, addressed the court with measured clarity. "Your Honor, this testimony is not merely anecdotal. The child has provided specific details about the crime, which are being corroborated through trained K-9 behavior. The defendant's actions are now being substantiated in multiple, independent ways." The defense attorney's protests became increasingly desperate. "This is preposterous. A toddler and a dog cannot define the course of justice." But Judge Hartwell remained unwavering. "This court will not ignore the testimony provided. Extraordinary circumstances demand careful consideration. The child's observations, combined with the K-9's trained responses, will be recorded and considered as part of the evidentiary process." Every person in the courtroom felt the tension escalate. This was no longer a normal trial. It had become a spectacle of truth, innocence, and instinct converging in a way that no one could have anticipated. Elizabeth hugged Emma once more, whispering, "You're amazing, my sweet girl." Emma merely nodded, her attention still locked on the defendant. She had spoken truth, and her innocence lent it power that adults could not override. Rex remained vigilant, every movement measured, every muscle taut. Officer Daniels whispered softly, "Good boy, Rex. Stay focused." The dog's response was immediate and precise, confirming Emma's words without fail. The judge cleared her throat, her voice cutting through the tension. We will now allow the child and the K-9 to provide additional details under careful supervision. Every observation will be recorded and scrutinized. This court recognizes the unprecedented nature of the testimony, but also acknowledges its potential significance. Spectators leaned forward, captivated by the unfolding drama. The cameras clicked, flashes illuminating the courtroom in a rhythm that seemed to echo the beating hearts of everyone present. Even seasoned journalists, accustomed to shocking events, whispered among themselves. This was a moment that would define careers, headlines, and public memory. Martin Keller's composure continued to deteriorate. His hands trembled slightly on the table, and his eyes darted nervously between Emma and Rex. The weight of exposure pressed down on him, and he realized that he could no longer rely on conventional defense strategies. The truth, delivered by a child and reinforced by a K-9, was now undeniable. Emma, sensing the gravity of her words, spoke once more, her small voice unwavering. He wanted the puppy gone. The courtroom shivered collectively. The words were simple, yet devastatingly revealing. Every adult present understood that this was more than testimony. It was a revelation of hidden cruelty, brought to light by the innocence of a child and the precision of a trained dog. The judge tapped her gavel once more, regaining silence. The court acknowledges the extraordinary courage of the child and the critical observations provided. We will proceed with careful verification and follow-up questioning. This case has taken an extraordinary turn, and all parties must respond accordingly. The courtroom exhaled as one, though the tension remained thick. Cameras clicked, reporters scribbled, and spectators whispered in disbelief. Justice, it seemed, had taken an unexpected path, guided by innocence, instinct, and truth. Officer Daniels patted Rex gently on the head. "Good boy," he murmured, his eyes scanning the courtroom. The dog's response had been flawless, confirming the child's observations and further cornering the defendant. Elizabeth held her daughter tightly, tears slipping down her cheeks. "You're so brave, my little hero." Emma simply nodded, her eyes still fixed on Martin Keller. She had spoken truth, and she had done so with unwavering courage. Martin Keller, finally realizing the precariousness of his situation, slumped slightly in his chair. The courtroom had become a stage for a truth that could not be hidden, revealed by forces he could neither manipulate nor intimidate. The courtroom felt as though it were suspended in time. Every person present, the judge, the attorneys, the officers, the spectators, was acutely aware that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Emma, barely 3 years old, remained perched on her chair, tiny hand gripping her mother. For reassurance, her blue eyes locked on the defendant, Martin Keller. Beside her, Rex, the German Shepherd K-9, sat alert, every muscle taut, ears pricked, and gaze unbroken. The tension was palpable. Each breath in the room seemed amplified. The air was thick with anticipation, anxiety, and the unspoken knowledge that what happened next could decide the trajectory of the trial. Judge Hartwell leaned forward on the bench, her gavel resting lightly on the wood. "Emma," she said gently but firmly, "the court understands that you have seen something very important. Can you tell us exactly what happened when the puppy was hurt?" Emma's small lips pressed together. For a moment she was silent, gathering her thoughts. Then her tiny finger shot toward the defendant. "He picked it up," she whispered, "and threw it in the box." A collective gasp echoed across the room. Spectators murmured in disbelief. Cameras clicked furiously, capturing the child's trembling determination and the dog's unwavering focus. Reporters scribbled as if their hands could barely keep up with the unfolding scene. Officer Daniels knelt beside Rex, murmuring softly, "Good boy, stay focused." Rex shifted slightly, letting out a low, controlled growl, a trained signal to indicate recognition of what the child had described. Every seasoned officer present recognized the meaning immediately. The dog's behavior confirmed Emma's words. Claire Reynolds, the prosecuting attorney, took a careful step forward, her voice calm but charged with intensity. "Your Honor, the child's testimony is specific and corroborated by trained K-9 behavior. The defendant's actions are being verified in real time through multiple independent indicators. This is unprecedented, but the weight of evidence is clear." The defense attorney, sweating and pale, rose abruptly. "Objection! This is preposterous. The courtroom is allowing a toddler and a dog to dictate the outcome of a trial. This is not a legitimate method of determining guilt." Judge Hartwell held up a hand. "Objection noted," she said firmly. "But the court recognizes the extraordinary nature of these circumstances and the corroboration provided. We will proceed, ensuring that the child's observations and the K-9's responses are verified as accurately as possible." Emma, sensing the gravity of the moment, spoke again, her tiny voice firm despite the tremor of emotion in it. "He wanted it gone." The courtroom shuddered as the words landed. Simple, yet horrifying in implication. The audience leaned forward, some covering their mouths in shock, others whispering fervently. Even seasoned officers and lawyers exchanged glances, acknowledging the truth that lay in the child's observation and the dog's instinct. Rex, trained to respond to such cues, let out a soft bark, then moved closer to the defendant. His gaze never wavered. Officer Daniels tightened his grip on the leash, feeling the dog's tension resonate with the seriousness of the courtroom. This was not play. This was recognition, a trained confirmation of what had been witnessed. Elizabeth, Emma's mother, felt her heart hammering in her chest. She held her daughter tightly, whispering encouragement. "You're so brave, my little girl." But Emma's focus remained unwavering. She had a mission: to reveal the truth, no matter her age or size. The defense attorney's face turned an ashen gray as he realized the magnitude of what was happening. "Your Honor, I insist. This is irrational. A child cannot be a credible witness, and a dog's behavior is purely instinctual. This cannot be admissible." Judge Hartwell leaned forward, eyes steely. "This court acknowledges your objection, but we are dealing with unique evidence. The child has provided specific observations. The K-9 has demonstrated trained behavioral confirmation. This will be documented and considered in the proceedings. We are proceeding with careful verification." Claire Reynolds stepped closer to the witness stand, addressing the room with controlled authority. "This is more than circumstantial. The child has provided specific, detailed observations about the crime. Rex's response is trained, precise, and deliberate. The convergence of these two independent sources of identification creates a significant corroboration that demands attention." Spectators shifted in their seats, some whispering excitedly, others wide-eyed in disbelief. Cameras flashed as journalists documented the unfolding drama. The courtroom had transformed from a routine trial into a historic spectacle, a moment where innocence and instinct intertwined to reveal hidden truths. Martin Keller, for the first time in weeks, appeared genuinely vulnerable. His confident facade had crumbled, replaced by a twitching jaw and nervous fidgeting. He had faced detectives, interrogators, and witnesses before, but nothing had prepared him for the piercing clarity of a 3-year-old child and the trained intuition of a K-9. Emma, her small chest rising and falling rapidly, leaned slightly forward. "He lied," she whispered again, her words carrying weight far beyond their simplicity. The courtroom seemed to shiver collectively. Everyone, from the judge to the spectators, understood the gravity of the declaration. It was more than an accusation. It was an unveiling of a truth that had been hidden until now. Rex shifted again, a subtle motion, then sat squarely, ears pricked, eyes fixed on the defendant. Officer Daniels knew instantly what this meant: confirmation. The dog's training was precise. There was no misinterpretation here. The judge tapped her gavel lightly, regaining control of the room. "We will now proceed with further examination and documentation of the child's testimony and the K-9's response. This court recognizes the extraordinary significance of what has been presented. All parties must respond accordingly. Elizabeth clutched her daughter tightly, whispering, "My brave little girl." Emma gave a small nod, still focused on the defendant. Her innocence lent her words power. She was speaking truth with clarity, courage, and unwavering determination. The courtroom was silent, the tension reaching a crescendo. Every person present understood the implications. Martin Keller had been cornered, exposed not by evidence that could be manipulated or lies that could be told, but by innocence and instinct working in tandem. Emma's final words, barely audible but crystal clear, pierced the room. He wanted everyone to forget. The courtroom collectively froze. Every spectator, officer, attorney, and even the judge recognized the meaning behind her words. It was not just about the puppy. It was about deceit, concealment, and a malicious intent that had gone unnoticed until this moment. Martin Keller's eyes darted wildly, searching for a way out, but the weight of exposure was too great. For the first time, he realized that no adult strategy, no legal maneuver, and no intimidation could erase the clarity of a child's perception reinforced by a K-9's trained instincts. Rex let out a low, steady growl, the sound carrying through the silent room like a verdict in itself. Officer Daniels placed a reassuring hand on the dog's collar. "Good boy," he whispered. "You've done your job." The judge, observing the combined effect of the child's testimony and the K-9's behavior, adjusted her glasses and tapped her gavel again. "The court will take all extraordinary testimony into consideration. We are witnessing a unique moment in the pursuit of justice, and it will not be ignored." Spectators leaned forward, cameras flashed, and the atmosphere in the room was electric. Justice was no longer a matter of procedure. It was unfolding in real time, guided by the courage of a child and the instinct of a dog. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath, the tension so thick it was almost tangible. Emma, barely 3, sat perched on her chair, tiny fingers still entwined with her mother. Her wide blue eyes, innocent yet piercing, remained locked on Martin Keller. Beside her, Rex, the K-9 whose training and instinct had become crucial evidence, stood alert, every muscle taut, ears pricked, eyes unwavering. The air buzzed with anticipation, as if the room itself recognized that this was the moment where truth would finally emerge. Judge Hartwell, her expression composed but intense, tapped the gavel lightly. "We are now entering the final phase of testimony and verification," she announced. "This court acknowledges the extraordinary nature of the evidence presented by the child and the K-9. We will proceed with careful attention and deliberate consideration." Martin Keller shifted nervously, his hands fidgeting on the table. His usual bravado had vanished. For the first time, he appeared genuinely vulnerable. The child's piercing words and the dog's instinctive responses had dismantled every defense he had relied upon. Every subtle twitch of Rex, every emphatic point from Emma, had corralled him into a corner from which there was no escape. Elizabeth, Emma's mother, held her daughter tightly, whispering reassurance. "You're so brave, Emma, my little hero," but Emma, focused entirely on the unfolding truth, simply nodded. She was not seeking praise, she was bearing witness. Claire Reynolds, the prosecuting attorney, rose from her seat with purposeful calm. Her voice carried across the hushed courtroom. "Your Honor, the child has provided specific details regarding the harm inflicted on the puppy. Her testimony is precise, corroborated by trained K-9 behavior. The defendant's actions are now revealed in a clear and undeniable sequence." The defense attorney's face had gone pale. "Objection! This is preposterous. The courtroom is relying on the observations of a 3-year-old and a dog trained for detection. This is not admissible." Judge Hartwell raised a hand. "Objection noted. However, the court recognizes the extraordinary convergence of evidence and observation. This testimony and the K-9's trained confirmation will be considered as part of the evidentiary record." Emma, sensing the gravity of the moment, took a small breath. Her tiny finger extended toward the defendant once more. "He wanted to hide it," she whispered. The courtroom seemed to shiver. Every person present understood the depth of the child's words. It was not just about the puppy. It was about intent, concealment, and malice that had gone undetected until now. The innocence of a child had pierced a carefully constructed veil of deception. Rex shifted, his powerful frame taut with focus. A soft, controlled growl resonated through the courtroom, a trained signal indicating recognition of the events described. Officer Daniels held the leash firmly, understanding that the dog's instincts were confirming the child's observations with precision. The spectators leaned forward, some covering their mouths, others whispering urgently. Cameras clicked incessantly, capturing the unprecedented scene. A toddler pointing with clarity, a police dog confirming with trained instinct, and a courtroom suspended on the precipice of truth. Claire Reynolds addressed the court with calm authority. "Your Honor, we request that the defendant be further questioned in light of these observations." The combination of the child's testimony and the K-9's confirmation establishes a credible narrative of actions and intent that cannot be ignored. Judge Hartwell adjusted her glasses, her gaze sweeping the courtroom. "Proceed with care. The court will ensure proper procedure is followed, but all evidence, including the child's observations and K-9 behavior, must be weighed accordingly." Elizabeth's hands shook as she held Emma. She whispered, "My sweet girl, this is so big." Emma's small hand squeezed her mother, in return, a silent acknowledgement that she understood the gravity of the moment. Martin Keller's defenses crumbled further. His eyes darted nervously from Emma to Rex and then to the judge. For the first time, he seemed entirely exposed, stripped of the manipulations and bravado he had relied upon. His lips trembled, but no words came. Emma, small yet resolute, spoke again. "He lied about it." The simplicity of the statement carried unimaginable weight. Every adult in the courtroom felt it, a chilling reminder that innocence often sees and speaks truths adults attempt to hide. Rex responded instinctively. He stepped closer to Keller, nose twitching, then sat firmly, a trained position indicating recognition and confirmation. Officer Daniels murmured, "Good boy, Rex," but the dog's eyes remained fixed, unwavering. The confirmation was clear. The K-9 and the child were aligned, revealing a reality the defendant could not deny. Judge Hartwell leaned forward, voice steady yet commanding. "The court acknowledges the corroborated testimony and behavioral confirmation. The defendant is now given the opportunity to respond to the evidence presented. All parties will proceed with utmost decorum." Keller's hands shook visibly as he opened his mouth, then closed it again. The weight of the child's words and the dog's instincts had stripped him of any confidence, any manipulation, any ability to hide. The truth had cornered him completely. Claire Reynolds approached the stand, her voice calm but unyielding. "Your Honor, the child has provided not only identification but specific observations of the crime. Rex has confirmed these observations through trained K-9 behavior. We request that this evidence be formally recognized and included in the record for determination." The judge nodded. "So ordered. The court will take all extraordinary testimony into consideration as it moves toward resolution. Justice must account for clarity, corroboration, and the undeniable revelation of truth." Spectators gasped softly, realizing the weight of the moment. This was no longer just a trial, it was a revelation. Cameras flashed, documenting history, a child, a dog, and the exposure of truth that adults alone could not uncover. Elizabeth held Emma, tears streaming down her cheeks. She whispered, "You've helped bring justice, my baby." Emma looked up briefly, small lips curved in a determined, almost knowing smile. She understood the power of her voice and her courage. Rex, sensing the conclusion, lowered his head slightly but remained alert. Officer Daniels whispered reassurance, "Good boy, Rex. You did it." The dog's instincts had guided the courtroom to truth, aligning perfectly with the child's observations. The judge cleared her throat, her gavel poised. In light of the extraordinary testimony and corroborating behavioral confirmation, this court recognizes the weight of the evidence presented. The matter before the court is now undeniable. Justice, guided by clarity and truth, must proceed. Keller's face drained of color. For the first time, he realized that deception, lies, and intimidation were powerless against the combination of innocence and instinct. He opened his mouth to speak but faltered. His defenses were gone. Emma, small yet courageous, spoke once more. "He can't hide it anymore." The courtroom shivered collectively. Every eye was locked on the child, the dog, and the defendant. Every heart pounded in recognition of the moment's magnitude. This was justice being delivered, not through force, argument, or manipulation, but through the unfiltered clarity of innocence and the trained instincts of a loyal K-9. Judge Hartwell raised her gavel. The court finds that the evidence, as presented through the extraordinary testimony of the child and the corroboration of the K-9, establishes the facts necessary for accountability. The defendant has been confronted by truth that cannot be denied. This court will now proceed with sentencing in accordance with established law. A collective exhale swept through the room. Reporters whispered excitedly, cameras clicked, and spectators looked on in awe. Justice had been served in a way that no one had expected. The tiny child, Emma, and the loyal dog, Rex, had rewritten the rules of courtroom revelation. Elizabeth hugged her daughter tightly. "You did it. You helped bring justice." Emma looked up, blue eyes gleaming, and smiled faintly. She had spoken truth, faced fear, and changed the outcome of the case with courage far beyond her years. Rex, now calm but still alert, wagged his tail slightly. Officer Daniels patted him gently. "Good boy, Rex, you helped too." Martin Keller slumped in his chair, finally confronted with the full weight of exposure. His attempts to deceive, manipulate, or intimidate had crumbled. In the end, the innocence of a child and the instinct of a trained K-9 had brought the truth to light. The judge's gavel fell, echoing through the courtroom, final and resolute. Justice has been served. And in that moment the courtroom erupted, not in chaos, but in recognition of something profound. Truth, no matter how small or unexpected, can never be silenced.